Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into a question that's fascinated people for centuries. What turns good people bad? Is it something we're born with? Or can any of us become, well, evil given the wrong set of circumstances?
That's a really profound question, and it's one that Philip Zimbardo tackles head-on in his book, The Lucifer Effect.
Yeah, the Lucifer Effect. Now, before we get into the book itself, maybe we should give our listeners a bit of background on Zimbardo himself.
Sure. Zimbardo is a prominent psychologist. He's best known for his research on the psychology of evil, and he has a really interesting background.
Yeah, he grew up in the South Bronx, right? I read that he was surrounded by poverty and violence as a kid.
Exactly. And he says that those early experiences really shaped his interest in the darker side of human nature. He wanted to understand how people who seemed ordinary could commit terrible acts.
So, the Lucifer Effect, what's the core idea here?
Well, Zimbardo argues that we tend to oversimplify evil. We like to think that there are good people and bad people, but Zimbardo says it's not that simple.
Okay, so it's not about good apples and bad apples. What is it about then?
It's about the situation, the context. Zimbardo argues that certain situations can exert such powerful influence that they can override our individual morals and values.
So even a good person, if put in the wrong situation, could do bad things.
Exactly. And Zimbardo uses a lot of real-world examples and research to back up this claim.
And the most famous example, of course, is the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Right. That's sort of the centerpiece of the book.
For those who might not be familiar, can you give us a rundown of what happened?
Well, in the summer of 1971, Zimbardo set up this mock prison in the basement of Stanford University.
I've seen the pictures. It looked pretty convincing, actually.
Yeah, they really went all out. And they recruited a bunch of college students who were all psychologically healthy.
Normal, average guys.
Yep. And they randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners.
And the idea was to see what would happen, right?
Yeah.
How they'd behave in those roles.
Exactly. But things went off the rails pretty quickly.
I bet.
Ah.
You put a bunch of college guys in charge. What do you expect?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Zimbardo actually implemented all these degradation rituals to dehumanize the prisoners.
Like what?
Well, they strip searched them, deloused them, made them wear these humiliating uniforms with numbers on them. And the guards were given these mirrored sunglasses so the prisoners couldn't see their eyes.
Wow. Sounds intense.
Yeah, it was. And the guards started abusing their power almost immediately.
Really? How so?
At first, it was subtle things like waking them up in the middle of the night for head counts and enforcing all these arbitrary rules.
It escalated, right?
Oh, yeah. It got really bad. The guards started making the prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands, putting them in solitary confinement, and using psychological tactics to break them down.
The poor prisoners. How did they react to all this?
Well, some of them rebelled. But many of them became withdrawn, passive. They started showing signs of severe stress. A few even had emotional breakdowns.
I remember reading that one prisoner, number 8612. He was really traumatized by the experience. He said something like, it was the head part, the psychological part that was the worst.
That's right. The psychological torture was just as bad, if not worse, than the physical stuff.
So how long did this go on for?
The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. But Zimbardo had to stop it after only 6 days.
Wow. It got that bad that fast.
Yeah. It was just too intense, too disturbing. Even Zimbardo himself admitted that he got caught up in the situation.
Yeah.
He started acting like a prison superintendent instead of an objective researcher.
That's kind of scary. It's like the experiment took on a life of its own.
Exactly. And that's Zimbardo's point.
What point is that?
The Stanford Prison Experiment demonstrates that the situation, the environment, can have a profound impact on our behavior. We can't underestimate the power of situational forces. They can overwhelm even the best of intentions.
And that's the essence of the Lucifer Effect, right? How good people can turn evil under the right, or I guess I should say the wrong, circumstances.
Right. It's a pretty chilling thought, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what Zimbardo covers in the book. He goes on to explore a whole range of social psychology research that sheds light on how we can be influenced to do things we never thought possible.
The Stanford Prison Experiment was pretty disturbing stuff.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, is that kind of thing a one-off? Or are there other examples of how situational forces can influence our behavior?
Oh, there are plenty. In fact, Zimbardo spends a good chunk of the Lucifer Effect talking about just that. He dives into all sorts of social psychology research.
Like what?
Well, One area he explores is conformity.
Conformity. Yeah, I remember learning about that in my Psych 101 class. It's the whole idea of going along with the crowd, right?
Exactly. And there's a ton of fascinating research that shows just how susceptible we are to group pressure.
So it's not just about teenagers wanting to fit in.
Nope. It goes way deeper than that. And the research shows that conformity can happen even when we know the group is wrong.
Wait, really?
Yeah. One of the classic studies on this is the Ashline experiment.
Ashline experiment. Rings a bell. Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Sure. So imagine you're in a room with a bunch of other people, and you're shown a line. Then you're shown 3 other lines, and you have to pick which one matches the first line in length.
Okay, sounds easy enough.
It is, except everyone else in the room is giving the wrong answer.
What? Like they're all in cahoots or something?
Exactly. They're all Confederates working with the experimenter. The real participant doesn't know that, of course.
So they're sitting there hearing everyone else say the wrong answer. I'd be freaking out.
I know, right? And the crazy thing is that a significant number of the participants conformed and gave the wrong answer too, even though it was blatantly obvious.
Wow. I guess peer pressure is a powerful thing.
It really is. And these conformity experiments highlight how easily we can be swayed by the group, even when we know it's wrong.
It makes you think twice about those times when you just go along with something, even if you have doubts.
Absolutely. We all want to fit in to be accepted, but sometimes that desire to belong can lead us astray.
And Zimbardo doesn't stop there, right? He goes even deeper into the idea of how we can be influenced to do bad things.
Right. He takes it to the next level with obedience to authority.
Oh boy, that sounds scary.
It is. He delves into the Milgram experiments. Have you heard of those?
Yeah, the ones of the electric shocks, right?
Exactly. Stanley Milgram wanted to see how far people would go in obeying orders from an authority figure, even if it meant harming another person.
Ugh, that's just messed up.
I know. But the results are fascinating in a terrifying sort of way. In Milgram's setup, participants were told they were taking part in a learning experiment. They were the teacher,
Okay.
and they had to deliver electric shocks to the learner every time they made a mistake.
The learner being another participant, I assume.
Well, not exactly. The learner was actually an actor who was pretending to be shocked.
So no one was actually getting hurt.
No, thankfully not, but the participants didn't know that.
I bet they were stressed out.
They were. They could hear the learner screaming in pain, begging them to stop. But the experimenter, this guy in a lab coat, kept telling them to continue.
So what happened? Did people actually go through with it?
A shocking number did. Over 60% of the participants went all the way, administering what they believed was a lethal shock.
Wow. Just wow. That's really hard to wrap my head around.
I know. It suggests that our ingrained tendency to obey authority can override our moral compass, leading us to do things we would never normally do.
It makes you wonder what you would do in that situation. Would you have the courage to say no?
That's the question, isn't it? And Zimbardo argues that there are certain factors that can make us more likely to obey, even when we know it's wrong.
Like what?
Well, things like the proximity of the authority figure, the perceived legitimacy of the authority, and the presence of others who are also obeying.
So if you're in a situation where you're being pressured to do something you're not comfortable with, it's important to be aware of these factors.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. If you understand how these social influences work, you're less likely to fall prey to them.
And that's just conformity and obedience. Zimbardo also talks about dehumanization, right?
Right. That's another key factor that contributes to evil behavior. When we dehumanize others, we strip them of their humanity. We see them as objects or enemies, not as people worthy of our compassion.
And that makes it easier to justify harming them.
Exactly. And Zimbardo uses some really chilling historical examples to illustrate this.
Like what?
Well, for instance, he talks about the Rwandan genocide.
Oh, that's just horrific.
It is. And one of the things that made the genocide possible was the dehumanization of the Tutsis. The Hutu propaganda machine portrayed them as cockroaches, as subhuman.
So basically they made it psychologically easier for people to kill them.
Exactly. And then we see similar patterns in other historical atrocities like the Holocaust.
So if dehumanization is a key ingredient in evil, what can we do to combat it?
Well, Zimbardo talks about the importance of empathy. We need to cultivate our ability to see the world through other people's eyes, to understand their experiences and to feel their pain.
Empathy. That's something we could all use a little more of these days.
Absolutely. And it's not just about feeling sorry for people. It's about recognizing their shared humanity. It's about seeing them as individuals, not as stereotypes or members of some outgroup.
And that's one of the key takeaways from the Lucifer Effect, right? That we all have the capacity for both good and evil. And the choices we make, the situations we find ourselves in, can tip the scales in one direction or another.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these forces, these situational influences, so we can resist them and choose the path of good.
So we've talked about conformity, obedience to authority, dehumanization, all these things that can contribute to evil behavior. But Zimbardo doesn't just leave us there, right? He brings it all together with some real-world examples.
Yeah. And one of the most powerful and disturbing examples he uses is the Abu Ghraib prison scandal.
Abu Ghraib. Man, that was tough to see those images when they came out.
It was. Those photos of Iraqi prisoners being abused by American soldiers, it was a huge scandal, and it really shook people's faith in, well, in humanity, I guess.
Yeah. And it's easy to look at those soldiers and think, those guys are monsters. How could they do such things?
Right. But Zimbardo says it's not that simple. He argues that Abu Ghraib wasn't just a case of a few bad apples, it was a systemic failure.
A systemic failure, meaning
Meaning that the situation, the environment at Abu Ghraib created a breeding ground for abuse.
So it's kind of like the Stanford Prison Experiment all over again, but on a much larger and more horrific scale.
Exactly. Zimbardo actually draws a lot of parallels between the two. He argues that there were a lot of similar situational factors at play.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, there was a lack of clear leadership and oversight at Abu Ghraib.
So nobody was really in charge.
Well, there was a chain of command, of course, but it was confusing and often contradictory. The soldiers weren't given clear guidelines or adequate training.
So they were basically making it up as they went along.
Pretty much. And they were also under a lot of pressure. Remember, this was during the Iraq War. Tensions were high, the soldiers were constantly on edge, worried about attacks.
So a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty.
Exactly. And that kind of environment can really wear people down. It can make them do things they wouldn't normally do.
And on top of all that, you had the dehumanization factor.
Right. The Iraqi detainees were seen as the enemy, as less than human. And that made it easier for the soldiers to justify mistreating them.
So it's like all those things we've been talking about, conformity, obedience, dehumanization. It all came together at Abu Ghraib to create this perfect storm of evil.
That's a good way to put it. And it's a really sobering thought. It shows that even in the modern world, with all our supposed enlightenment, we're still vulnerable to the same dark forces that have been plaguing humanity for centuries.
So what's the takeaway here? Is Zimbardo saying that we're all doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?
Not necessarily. He's not saying we're all destined to become evil, but he is saying that we need to be aware of these situational forces, these psychological mechanisms that can lead us down a dark path.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. If we understand how these things work, we can be more mindful of our own behavior. We can resist the temptation to conform, to blindly obey authority, to dehumanize others.
So what can we do? What are some concrete steps we can take to resist these negative influences?
Well, Zimbardo has a whole bunch of suggestions. He talks about the importance of critical thinking, of questioning authority, of developing a strong moral compass.
And sticking to your values even when it's hard.
Right. He also emphasizes the importance of empathy, of seeing the humanity in others.
And speaking out against injustice, even when it's risky.
Exactly. It's about being an active participant in creating a more just and compassionate world.
So, the Lucifer Effect. It's a dark book. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature. But ultimately, I think it's a hopeful book. It shows us that we're not powerless. We have choices. We can choose to resist the pull of the dark side. We can choose to be better.
I agree. It's a powerful reminder that we all have the potential for both good and evil. And the choices we make, the situations we find ourselves in, can tip the scales in one direction or the other.
So if you're interested in exploring the dark side of human nature, but also in finding hope and inspiration for how to be a force for good in the world, I highly recommend checking out The Lucifer Effect. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it. And that's it for our deep dive into The Lucifer Effect. Thanks for joining us, Dave.